It's wonderful to have you join us. A couple of things before we get started. So, oh, and I guess I should press record.
I got it.
Thank you.
I got it, Maria.
Okay, thank you. So if you've been attending the conference thus far, you know that the sessions are being recorded, but feel free to voice any concerns that you might have in this regard. None of the recordings will be shared or made public without your consent, rest assured. Questions and discussion will be reserved for the end of the session, so please hold on to your questions and keep your microphones muted throughout the presentations. Luckily, because it looks like we have two presenters today, we'll have hopefully plenty of time for discussion at the end. So we'll begin with Hanna Lucas. Hanna is a PhD candidate at Durham University, and her research focuses on mystagogy in the 4th century. Her paper today is entitled Mind the Gap, Avoiding Methodological Iconoclasm in Interdisciplinary Approaches to Christian Texts. Thanks so much, Hanna.
Great. Okay. Thank you. Do I sound clear? Yes. Awesome. Okay. Pardon me. So, interdisciplinarity is clearly an enrichment to academic research. Recent decades have seen and enjoyed the cross-pollination between disciplines, and this is no less present in early Christian studies. Patristics has equally been touched by the various empirical turns that have touched all of the humanities. For instance, the expansion of the patrologist toolbox through the fruitful fraternization with the social sciences. These turns broaden and diversify the horizons of the discipline. However, there remains a question about the fittingness of these tools. So, while by no means advocating for a magisterial curtailing or policing of the analytical tools available to the researcher, I propose nevertheless to problematize any uncritical adoption of certain contemporary approaches, and more importantly, the philosophical commitments which undergird them, as it is here at the level of metaphysical underpinnings where fittingness can be discerned. I will present a case study to explore and make explicit the friction that I suggest exists between some of the tools of the patrologist cum social scientist and the patristic world and its artifacts. So our case study commences with an article written by Georgia Frank in 2001. Taste and See the Eucharist and the Eyes of Faith in the 4th Century. Georgia Frank has written extensively on the role of the senses, embodiment, and emotion in the thought and practices of early Christians. And she is a great example of a scholar who has adroitly incorporated and adapted analytical paradigms from the social sciences and psychology into her discussions of the lives of early Christians. What I'm keen to bring to the surface here is not primarily the content of her argument, but the form, that is the language she uses to describe the aims and understanding of the 4th century preachers she surveys in the article. These are the mystagogical bishops, Ambrose, Cyril of Jerusalem, John Chrysostom, and Theodore of Mopsuestia. So a certain grammar asserts itself in the application of anthropological frameworks to their homilies. And I mean to highlight the difference between this grammar and that of the mystagogues themselves. So in her article, Frank enlists the aid of ritual studies in her account of what these 4 bishops mean by the eyes of faith, and in her identification of their mystagogical strategies. Frank reads the mystagogical homilies as repositories of rhetorical and embodied techniques for perception conditioning. She thus suggests, quote, "The eyes of faith stood for a variety of mental images and visual processes. These visual strategies generated a host of mental images that would reframe the physical perception of the Eucharist. It is in Frank's explanation of the mechanisms for building and infusing Christian perceptions, experiences, and dispositions where Frank has recourse to the grammar of ritual studies. She speaks of the mystagogues constructing and curating imaginal bodies by which to guide the physical perceptions of the ritual participants. What I'd like to draw out is how Frank's reading of the strategies of the mystagogues relates these strategies closely with cognition, with the subject, even in her attentiveness to materiality. As she says, the mental images invoked by preachers constructed and thereby situated divine presence in Eucharistic space. By this steady layering of imaginal bodies over physical perceptions, the initiate was prepared to perceive and receive the Eucharist. In one salient example, Frank deals with a particular analogy which Chrysostom uses to express the transformation effected in baptism. Chrysostom analogizes the idea of an artist who first sketches the royal figure and then, as he says, daubs on the true color. Chrysostom then likens this to the human soul, and this is Chrysostom. Consider that your soul is an image. Before daubing on the true color of the spirit, erase the bad habits which have become implanted in you, so that after the pigments have been daubed on and the royal image shines forth, you may never thereafter blot it out or cause wounds or scars on the beauty which God has given you. Now, Georgia Frank uses Chrysostom's analogy as an analogy for how she understands the project of the mystagogues, this generating of mental images to guide the perceptions and understanding of the ritual participant. So then Frank on this text writes, the mind's ability to generate the needed mental images was critical for the eyes of faith. Thus, Chrysostom compared preparing for baptism to making a sketch. Until the color was applied, the artist was free to erase, correct, or substitute the image. Like the wine-stained mouth of the communicant, the entire moral self was tinctured through mental imagery. It's just an awesome line. In addition to brilliance, Chrysostom added color and space to the imaginal bodies he conjured. So Frank interprets Chrysostom's teaching on the eyes of faith as the conditioning of cognition. In her footnotes, Frank acknowledges the theorists that have informed her approach. One she identifies particularly is ritual theorist Catherine Bell. So if we follow the breadcrumbs from Frank into Bell and Bell's discussion of ritual theory, we can better tease out the implicit metaphysical commitments of the method. In ritual theory, ritual practice, Catherine Bell gives a historiography of the primary movements in the development of ritual studies as a discipline. And while this is not my home turf, so I admit I have not grasped the nuance or gravity of the evolution she traces, one common commitment seems to stand forth as underlying the whole project. And that is a modern nominalist ontology, an account of being, of nature and matter and the human mind, wherein the world is fundamentally a neutral arena upon which humanity fashions and imposes meaning. And this essentially arbitrary construction of mechanisms, mediations, structures of meaning is culture, the object of inquiry for the social scientist. The commitment is implicit rather than explicit most of the time, But if I can present a few quotations from Bell, then perhaps it will shine through. So in the early 20th century, Bell tells us, Emil Durkheim, quote, reintroduces ritual as the means by which collective beliefs and ideals are simultaneously generated, experienced, and affirmed as real by the community. When Bell comes to articulate her own position, she speaks of ritual as a type of social strategy. Acting ritually, Bell argues, is first and foremost a matter of nuanced contrasts and the evocation of strategic, value-laden distinctions. One of the clearest points where the ontology that sustains this method appears is in Bell's summary of the thought of anthropologist Clifford Geertz. So this is Bell explaining Geertz's approach. Meaning for the outside theorist comes differently, insofar as he or she can perceive in ritual the true basis of its meaningfulness for the ritual actors. That is, its fusion of conceptual and dispositional categories. Then, the theorist can go beyond mere thought about activity to grasp the meaningfulness of the ritual. By recognizing the ritual mechanism of meaningfulness for participants, the theorist can in turn grasp its meaningfulness as a cultural phenomenon. So this language, ironically, mirrors that of the mystagogues when they speak about baptism and the birth of the eyes of faith. Just as in baptism, the eyes of the heart are opened, so Ambrose says, and the initiate sees clearly, so here for Geertz, it is the theorist who, by his method of recognizing the mechanism of meaningfulness, sees the truth. So I would like to contrast what I've highlighted in Frank and Bell, admittedly all too briefly, with the voice and grammar of Chrysostom himself. In one of his baptismal homilies, Chrysostom speaks about the kind of illumination that comes with baptism and initiation. So he says, whenever grace comes and drives out the darkness from our mind, we learn the exact nature of things. What frightened us before now becomes contemptible in our eyes. We no longer are afraid of death after we have learned carefully from this holy initiation that death is not death, but sleep and a repose which lasts but for a time. So we'll stay with Chrysostom's language to try to tease out the ontological conviction that attends and suffuses Chrysostom's preaching. An ontological conviction that I am suggesting the current tools and grammar of the social sciences are incapable of identifying and capturing. So I want to focus on a phrase that's repeated twice in this quotation, and actually more than twice in the wider section where it appears. This is where Chrysostom says that with the dawn of the light of grace, we learn the exact nature of things, and a little later that we learn carefully from this holy initiation that death is not death. So the term I want to draw attention to is this idea of exactness. In Greek, the word is akribeia. I'm going to use akribeia as a thematic place for us to find something of a rebuttal to the ontology operative in the grammar of ritual studies. So akribeia means precision, exactness, accuracy. It implies, especially in an antique, vaguely Platonist setting, a relation to truth, but not in a forensic, empirical, and solely immanent way, though yes, that is a primary use of this word. But anyways, akribeia, crucially, especially for the Christians, implies a relationship with the transcendent, with perfection and even teleology, at least as I will show in Chrysostom. David Reilersdam's book, John Chrysostom on Divine Pedagogy, contains an illuminating trace of Chrysostom's use of akribeia. It appears in two distinct yet interrelated senses. So first, akribeia describes the self-knowledge of the divine persons. Chrysostom says on the incomprehensibility of God, all things concerning him are precisely met akribeias, precisely known only by the Son and the Holy Spirit and by no one else. However, Chrysostom also strikingly uses akribeia to speak about the divine and salvific pedagogy present preeminently in Christ's incarnation, but also in scripture and in creation. For our purposes, it's the third precision, the precision of creation, that is germane to my argument. So that is to say, there's some kind of exactness of divine teaching, albeit accommodated and derived, that is inherently present in creation. So when Chrysostom suggests that initiation brings the capacity to learn the exact nature of things, this entails both an indigenous content, a communication of truth latent in creaturely things, and also an inherent end for the faculties of perception and intellection, such that to learn with exactness suggests that human seeing and learning are ordered towards the perceiving of the indigenous theological meaning of the world, and through these towards the knowledge of God. So the distinction between this understanding and that of the social sciences lies in their accounts of the world, of being, in their ontologies, basically. The nature of the object of inquiry for ritual studies is broadly a neutral world over which religious and ritual conditioning is laid, wholly extrinsically and wholly arbitrarily. Georgia Frank reads Chrysostom's baptismal homily as rhetoric aimed at shaping cognition. Initiation is, on this reading, the cultivation of a disposition and the establishing of a particular thematic overlay. And beneath this account of the field of inquiry lies a full-fledged ontology. Here is where I would employ the analogy of iconoclasm. It's not that Chrysostom and ritual studies practitioners disagree about the human capacity to read the world theologically. It's that they disagree about whether the world bears truth. Does the initiate into the Christian mysteries discover or project meaning? The ontology operative in the methodologies of the social sciences are, in a way, iconoclastic. They map onto the iconoclast challenge: can matter represent God? It is apparent that Chrysostom's understanding of the acquisition of the eyes of faith through initiation suggests an ontology wherein the world is indigenously communicative of truth. Said another way, the world is iconic. The nature of created being is that it images and participates in the divine, which is its source. So the first issue to be aware of is simply the risk of anachronism. Suggesting that mystagogy is, I'm almost done, suggesting that mystagogy is solely or even primarily a project of perception conditioning at worst misrepresents or at best neglects the ontology that informs the mystagogue's pedagogy. Secondly, the issue with the ontological blind spot of these tools is not simply that they may struggle to represent a weighty theological core that undergirds early Christian writings. The deeper problem is that the theological, mystical, catechetical texts of the early church have as their intent theosis, sanctification, worship, communion with the divine. In other words, the drawing of nature into grace. And an integral part of this is the understanding of nature as indigenously ordered toward this end. So Georgia Frank's contribution to early Christian studies over the last 2 decades has admirably championed attentiveness to materiality and to embodiment in patristic writings. And this is a welcome disruption of the sometimes arid landscape of reading these texts as simply evolutionary links in the development of doctrinal debates, or as evidentiary deposits for the regional reconstruction of liturgical practice. In her article, she writes how Cyril's homilies validated the physical sensorium, even as he subordinated it to a spiritual one. I've tried to show here how the ontological commitments behind the methodologies of the social sciences, while they can confidently recall the reader and researcher to an attentiveness to the concrete, to the physical sensorium. In a sort of tragic irony, the lurking nominalism within the method steals from the practitioner the possibility of truly attending to the empirical and seeing the exact nature of things. Thank you.
Thank you, Hannah, for a really fantastic paper that does a lot of things with lots of rich material to ruminate on. I'll be thinking about it for a while. Okay, well, actually, what we might do, because we are missing our third scheduled participant, and Dawn has also volunteered to step in here. We might change our usual ordering and do questions for Hannah right now. So we'll take questions and discussion for Hannah right now, and then move on to our second presenter, Emmanuel. So if anyone has any questions, please feel free to raise your virtual hand, or you can put your question in the chat and we can read it out loud for you, as you prefer. Yes, John, go ahead.
Hannah, thank you for a wonderful paper. Your reference to Octavia and rhetoric has me thinking about Libanius. Wasn't Chrysostom a student of Libanius in Antioch? And might his rhetorical training, I'm thinking just historically, right, might not be what you're exactly interested in, but might not that training have influenced him in this way, and might fleshing out some of Libanius's own rhetorical theories and practice help to kind of flesh out a little bit more about what you're getting at?
Whoop, there I am. Yeah, certainly. Okay, so I'm not an expert on this bit. I know that it's traditionally believed that Chrysostom is a student of Libanius. I think I've read somewhere that that's debated, but we like to debate about all sorts of minute details. Here's my thought about rhetoric. Especially in David Rylarsdam's book, John Chrysostom and Divine Pedagogy, which is just awesome. Okay, first, yes, does this help us understand what Chrysostom is doing in his homilies, why he uses the metaphors that he uses, you know, how he employs emotion, pathos, ekphrasis, whatever. Yeah, great, that we kind of can map the devices he's using. But just what I find really interesting is how different writers, and especially contemporary writers, will turn to his rhetoric. And Georgia Frank also comments on the different rhetorical devices in Chrysostom, is that she'll still read these as techniques of conditioning. And I think as personally, I'm just so much more drawn to the theological. So it irks me when we're sort of stuck in this realm of kind of human techne, like sort of meaning making being the sort of neutral world, the subject, the mystagogue as the sort of shaper of a Christian disposition. And I wonder, I haven't really read about, Greco-Roman rhetoric, but I have this sneaking suspicion that ancient rhetoricians, maybe the more Platonic of them, wouldn't even understand their craft as simply tools of power. Actually, to kind of reflect back on your paper, John, that they wouldn't see them as simply tools of power, of kind of cognition shaping or argumentative, whatever. Now I'm just rambling. But anyways, that perhaps there was an understanding that we sometimes miss, an understanding of rhetoric, an understanding of mystagogy that we sometimes miss, that catches something deeper about the nature of reality and of aesthetics that aren't just instrumental. That's what I was trying to say. That aren't just instrumental. Sorry for talking so long.
Yes, Emmanuel, go ahead.
Thank you. And thank you, Hanna, for what I thought was really, really great paper. While I completely agree that it's somewhat of a narrow scope of inquiry whenever we limit ourselves to the power and the shaping of the self on the part of the mystagogue, I am not convinced that the argument based on the self-understanding of ancient authors is necessarily the strongest one to undo the kind of interpretation, because of course that kind of interpretation constantly presents itself as unveiling and disclosing a reality that's by almost constitutively concealed in the text. But actually my question was about was much more general, and I just wondered if you could know a bit more about the larger project that this piece is a part of.
This paper is just my pet peeve. my research is on these form mystagogues, and it's a much more kind of constructive theology. I mean, it's a little baby exercise in ressourcement. And so just in my reading of secondary and contemporary sources, I just kept seeing this sort of, I mean, what I called lurking nominalism. And I was like, why is this showing up? Why do these like eminent patristic scholars, at the forefront of interdisciplinary experiments, why do they sound like they don't believe these fathers? Like, why do they want to use words like conjure? And it just, especially that one gets me all hot and bothered. But so I mean, it's more of a philosopher's thorn, I guess. And I suppose I wonder if like the attraction is the empirical turn, right? And this attraction in the humanities to like, oh, this kind of late modern, postmodern attentiveness to materiality and embodiment, but and that being able to lift out this kind of particularity in the fathers that more kind of dogmatic readings of the fathers kind of can miss. And that's so, I'm totally on board with that. But when they go to reach for the tools to embrace that like particularity, that materiality, especially when we talk about the sacraments, they just I just feel like they kind of grab these blunt instruments. It's like the wrong tool for the right it's the wrong tool for the right job, in my opinion. When these scholars want to what did Georgia Frank say, like valuing the physical sensorium? Awesome. The mystagogues totally value the physical sensorium, but when the tools bear and bring with them a nominalist, to be honest, trailing its way to nihilist ontology, I just find that like we lose something really valuable. But then I'm getting like super kind of pontificating when I start. Anyways.
Not against pontificating here. Miriam, did you still have a question? No? So because we're in this strange situation now where we have extra time, but then also I think